The morning sun drifted slowly through the dusty windows of the lunchbox, casting long amber shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Jackie Harris stood behind the counter, wiping a stray smudge of flour from her apron and looking out at the empty booths with a mixture of hope and exhaustion. It was supposed to be a grand relief to finally have the doors open once more, a sign that life was returning to some semblance of normalcy. However, as the minutes ticked by, the silence of the room felt heavier than the bustle of business ever could. Jackie sighed, leaning against the cool surface of the counter. She whispered to her own shadow that it would be a far greater relief if the room were filled with paying customers instead of just her own colorful and spirited family members. She had pinned much of her hope on a new lasagna recipe, believing that those rich layers of pasta and savory sauce would be the secret key to turning her fortunes around. Across the room, the familiar faces of her family were gathered, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic debate. Becky leaned back in her chair, pointing out that Jackie had once claimed tips were far superior to a fixed salary because they offered a way to avoid the heavy hand of taxes. Jackie gave a weary smile, knowing that while her family could be difficult, they were not the kind of people who would ever truly leave her in a difficult position. They were a rough group, certainly, but they were not like those people in the news who lied about fake rowing scholarships to get their children into elite colleges. Those scandals had left a bitter taste for everyone else who simply wanted a fair shot at life. Dan sat nearby, nodding in agreement as he thought about how those people had ruined the chances for honest kids like Mark to be recognized for their true talents and hard work. Mark approached his mother, Darlene, with a heavy textbook tucked under his arm and a look of desperation in his eyes. He pleaded for help with a school report, asking if she was almost finished with her own mountain of work. Darlene let out a sharp and dry laugh, shaking her head as she explained that she was buried under an endless pile of performance reviews for assembly line workers. The task was tedious and strange, requiring her to rate human beings on a scale of 1 to 10 based on how well they had managed to keep their hands safe during their shifts. She asked Mark if he had at least finished reading the classic book entitled Walden, so they could discuss the deeper meanings together. Mark admitted he was falling far behind because he found the concept of transcendentalism impossible to grasp. He could not understand why a man would choose to live alone by a pond for so long without the company of others. The conversation soon turned into a family-wide debate about literature and philosophy. Becky admitted she had tried to read the summary notes, but even those felt too long and exhausting for her taste. Harris chimed in, claiming he knew all about the book, describing it as a simple story of a man living on a pond. Jackie quickly corrected him, pointing out that a person could only live on a pond during the winter when the water was frozen solid. It became clear that no one in the room had actually finished the text. Jackie declared with a mock frustration that if the book had been about the dramatic lives of modern housewives, they would have finished it in a single afternoon. She vowed then and there to get everyone in the family a library card to end this cycle of avoided learning once and for all. The front door creaked open and Neville walked in, carrying a vintage bottle of beer as if it were a precious treasure. He explained that it was a rare piece from Gary, Indiana, intended not for drinking, but as a decoration for the vintage trailer Dan was currently restoring. Dan's eyes lit up at the sight of the bottle. He explained that he had inherited the trailer from a dear friend who had passed away, and he and Louise had big plans to travel the open road once the world was safe and healthy again. Darlene listened with a touch of envy, wishing she could find a way to escape the constant stress of her daily life. She had advertisements to write for the local hardware store and a long list of chores, and the weight of her responsibilities felt like a heavy stone upon her shoulders. She decided she needed to head to the office just to find a single moment of quiet reflection away from the chaos of the household. While the family continued their lively exchange, a customer finished a plate of the new lasagna. Jackie watched him closely, surprised to see that he had eaten every single bite and left the fork clean. She suggested he leave a positive review online to help the struggling business. However, the customer informed her that there were already reviews online claiming the food was not even fit for a dog. One review even said the lasagna tasted like old car mats soaked in a puddle of thin ketchup. Jackie was horrified by the cruelty of the words, but the customer simply shrugged and said he was from Missouri and needed to see the truth for himself. Before Jackie could even process the insult, her daughter arrived with news that Louise wanted to make a video call. When the screen flickered to life, Louise appeared looking tired and pale. Dan greeted her with a warm smile, but the news she delivered was a shock to the entire room. She had tested positive for the illness that had been keeping everyone apart for so long. She was exhausted and had completely lost her sense of smell. She told Dan she needed to rest and would call him back later. The room went silent as the gravity of the situation settled in. Jackie wondered aloud if this meant she should open a second location since Louise would not be coming in for lunch, but Neville quickly reminded them that the situation was far more serious than business. Dan was devastated, unable to believe how quickly things had changed. He was determined to go to her and take care of her despite the loud and frantic protests of his family. Darlene was terrified for her father's health, reminding him that he was the very definition of a person with underlying health conditions. She did not want to find him gone because of a stubborn decision. Dan, however, was moved by a deep sense of loyalty and love. He argued that if he were the one who was sick, Louise would be there for him in a heartbeat. He promised to wear a mask and keep a safe distance, but he was going to stay at her place to make sure she was okay. The family watched him go with a mixture of admiration and fear. They realized they all needed to be tested now. They joked about the high cost of rapid tests, suggesting they pile 8 or 9 people into a single car to save money at the drive-up window. Later that evening, Darlene returned home with a bag of cheap dinner items, her face pale with worry. She confessed to her sister that she was terrified she might have been the one to give the illness to Louise. Becky tried to tell her she was being paranoid, but Darlene admitted she had done something foolish. She had been feeling overwhelmed by anxiety and had been visiting an indoor pool at a hotel to find some peace. On her last visit, she had fallen asleep and woken up to find herself in the middle of a crowded birthday party where no one was following the safety rules. She had seen Louise a few days later, and now the weight of her choices felt like a crushing burden. She begged Becky not to tell the rest of the family until her own test results were back. Meanwhile, Dan sat outside Louise's house, refusing to leave his post. He had brought groceries, a new toothbrush, and even some fresh clothing. Louise pleaded with him through the window to go home and stay safe, but Dan was as stubborn as a mountain. He sat in his chair watching the birds and refusing to move until she changed her mind about letting him help. Inside the lunchbox, Jackie was on a mission to find out who had written the terrible reviews. Neville, using his skills as a veterinarian to notice patterns, pointed out that all the bad reviews were for the specific types of food Jackie had added to compete with other local restaurants. Jackie realized she was being targeted by her competitors in a coordinated effort to shut her down. She decided she was going to march down to those other restaurants and speak her mind with honesty and fire. She insisted that Neville wear a dark suit and act as her legal representative, hoping his presence would scare them into telling the truth. Neville was hesitant, but Jackie pleaded with him, saying she needed him to stand up for her. They went to the first restaurant, where Jackie confronted the owner about the fake reviews. Neville, surprising even himself, found a burst of protective energy and threatened the owner with legal action that would take away everything he owned. The owner, intimidated by the sudden intensity, agreed to take the review down immediately. While Jackie was thrilled by the victory, Neville felt uneasy about the aggression. He told Jackie that he hated being dishonest and that he did not want their relationship to be based on fear or power. He wanted them to be equals. Jackie was taken aback, realizing she had been taking his kindness for granted. They shared a moment of genuine connection and decided to head back to his place, their bond stronger than it had ever been. Back at home, Dan was still worried about Louise, but Harris tried to cheer him up by offering to help with the mechanical parts of the vintage trailer. Dan admitted he was scared of the future, but Harris reminded him that Louise was a strong and resilient woman. Darlene finally received her test results, and they were negative. She felt a massive wave of relief wash over her, but she knew she still had to be honest with Ben. She confessed where she had been and why she had lied, explaining that she had been struggling with the pressure of her new job and the weight of being the one everyone depended on for support. Ben listened quietly and admitted that he also felt the need to get away from everything sometimes. They realized they needed to trust each other enough to be honest about their feelings, even when those feelings were difficult to hear or share. They spent the evening sharing small and honest truths about their lives, finding a new level of healing and growth. They learned that Louise had not actually gotten sick from Darlene, which lifted the final burden of guilt from Darlene's heart. To finish the night on a positive note, the family looked through some old vacation photos they had found hidden in the vintage trailer. They discovered that Dan's old friend had been leading a very different life than they had ever imagined, with photos of many different women at various national parks across the country. They laughed together, finding joy in the strange turns of life and the strength of their own family connection. They realized that as long as they remained honest and stayed together, they could face any challenge the future might bring. The values of honesty, love, and family were the true treasures that would keep them moving forward with hope and laughter.